He dug his fingers into the damp earth as if he could feel the shape of Matteo under his hands. The soil resisted and sighed, and Sarah screamed his name until the sound tore like raw paper. The alien, taller than any man, coat flickering with static like a storm caught in fiber, stood at the head of the grave and watched her with glass dark eyes that held no pity and everything she had been missing. He spoke her son's name exactly, with an accent that made the syllables taste of sea spray and old radio signals, and the sound rearranged the room of her memory until objects fell. The photo on the car dashboard, the childish scrawl on a birthday card, the hollowed-out calendar with the anniversary circled in pencil. Matteo. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The hill smelled like rain and crushed lavender. Cemetery grass bowed under the weight of memory. Sarah's hands were mud-stiff, knuckles white around the bouquet she had not been brave enough to set down. She knew the rules of ritual: 1 bouquet, 1 photograph, 3 whispered lies, and 1 truth. But she had never in her life expected to be interrupted by an emissary from some bookless corner of the universe. Her breath misted and trembled. The alien cocked his head as if listening to something only he could hear, and the coat's edges blurred between black and static blue. He looked nothing like the monsters of late-night feeds. He looked, impossibly, like an ambassador. "You know him," he said, and it was not a question. His voice vibrated in Sarah's sternum like a remembered song. Matteo Alvarez. It was the way he said the accentless surname, Alvarez, slid into an alien cadence that made blood run cold. It was also the way he pronounced was, as if time itself were negotiable. Was not a casualty, he finished. He was a bridge. The sentence detonated everything. The bouquet slipped from Sarah's wet hands, petals scattering like pale confessions. She tasted iron and old milk, and then, absurdly, the adult bitterness she had always hated in coffee. "Who are you?" she asked before she could stop the sound. Her voice cracked. The question was the only science left to her, a measurement she could hold up to whatever anomaly had the gall to stand where other mothers placed candles. "I am Kale," he said. "Envoy. We call the project Progress." His glass eyes reflected a slice of sky and the small church on the hill. "You are Sarah Alvarez, astrophysicist, mother, person who keeps a denied file in a drawer with a label that smells faintly of cigarette smoke." She recoiled as if burned by truth itself. The denied file, that stack of stamped papers she had pulled from under a box of Matteo's shoes and shoved back into a drawer when the world refused to realign, was not something she had spoken aloud in years. Yet here, in the space between her sobs and the alien static coat, Kale seemed to know the exact grain of her embarrassment. How? She could not finish. Her mind, trained in cold calculations and the clean logic of astrophysics, tried to compute with insufficient variables. Kale stepped closer, and the world thinned. A hum rose in the air like a distant radio, and the hairs on Sarah's forearms lifted. He extended a hand, not in menace, but in an offering that felt disturbingly intimate. "Proof," he said simply. "Fragments, recording, memory grafts, evidence the agency burned because it feared a species, both yours and ours, would unmade themselves." Sarah imagined Agent Klein's eyes under a brimmed hat, a black sedan waiting at the bottom of the hill, Agent Klein pressing palms to a file and erasing the bits that mattered. Klein and his ilk, badges, clipped smiles, the kind of rational cruelty that kept secrets in basements. had called Mateo's death an accident and her grief a liability. The shuttle that had been Mateo's last night in the world had been off the record, an unacknowledged test that left a hole in the official ledger and a scar across her life. Denied file. Accident. Closure. Why come to me? Her voice narrowed into a thread of accusation and hunger. Why now? Cale's glass eyes tilted to the sky, where clouds dragged themselves like slow wounds. Because you are an instrument. You measure the impossible and name it. You could be a bridge, as your son was, between understanding and acceptance. You could show your world what we meant when we promised aid. She thought of his word, aid, and tasted salt and fear. Sarah had not meant to become an evangelist for grief. She had once believed science could distill pain into numbers and prognoses. Grief, she had decided, was messy, a planet not yet mapped. Mateo's death had proven maps were lies. He had worked on the clandestine shuttle program, brilliant, impatient, smudged with grease and hope. Officially, he had been a volunteer. Unofficially, Sarah had begun to suspect that the shuttle had carried more than metal. Her nights had been a patchwork of intercepted signals and enraged, half-read memos stamped with the word denied. She kept the file because she could not stay away from the itch of doubt. She kept it because it felt like a thread to tug. Cale reached into his coat and produced a shard no larger than a coin. It shimmered with an iridescence that did not belong to the graveyard's palette. It thrummed against his palm like a living heartbeat in a foreign language. This fragment belongs to what made him a bridge, he said. Not human, not ours, both. The hum crept into Sarah like cold and a memory she had forgotten she had. Images flickered behind her lids. Mateo, laughing with a greasy wrench in his hands, telling her he would prove the world wrong. Mateo, curled on the sofa with a fever once, watching stars projected on the ceiling and telling her aloud that they were not empty. Mateo's hands, always a little too big for his face, trying to fix something he could not name. The images were not accusations, but constellations rearranging themselves into a different sky. "How do I know you aren't some con?" Her voice was brittle. She was used to skepticism. She had made a career of it. Her training demanded reproducibility, controls, proofs. An alien offering an iridescent shard and sentences that rearranged the grammar of her life did not fit into neat lab protocols. Cale's face, if it could be called that, showed something like empathy, or the alien approximation of it. He did not smile. "You will have recording," he promised. "Audio of the shuttle's last minutes, unedited and unburned. Logs that show a genetic alteration. The truth of the program's intentions. But there is another truth, the grafted memory. We can return parts of what you lost, if you allow the graft." The word graft hung in the air like a scalpel. Sarah had spent nights telling herself she would not bargain with hope. She had folded new griefs into old ones, controlled them like experiments. But standing on the hill with the smell of rain and dirt and the specter of her boy, the promise of regained memory felt like a lever on a locked door. If Cale could slide back even a shard of Mateo, his laugh, the cadence of his curse words, the particular way he said "mama," then her life might relight. Her hands closed around the idea as if it were a lifeline. "You're asking me to believe you can restore him?" Her voice was small, cracked. "To bring back the parts I buried?" "We can remind you," Cale said. "We can graft back traces that will become indistinguishable from what you think you remember. The difference will be that those traces will be accurate." He paused. "More dangerous, perhaps, because they will force new questions." Agent Klein's name hovered at the edge of Sarah's mind like bad weather. He had been the human face of the program's secrecy. Shark jaw, sharper lies. Klein would call Kyle a liar and then call him an enemy. He would want the shard, the recordings, perhaps Kyle's glass eyes. Sarah could taste the shape of those negotiations already. A black sedan waiting at the bottom of the hill. The press swarming once something leaked. Public faith in institutions dissolving in a panicked wash. Civilians who could not stomach the idea that their bodies had been bartered in a ledger of progress. "You know what they did to me," she said, and the admission was an offering. "They denied me my right to ask. They called me hysterical. Her throat tightened. Mateo's room, still smelling faintly of lemon soap, still lit by a half-burned nightlight. They buried my son and then closed the file. Kyle tilted his head. For a moment, his glass eyes shivered with an internal light. They had reasons. "Tell me," she snapped automatically. The scientist in her could not stop. Questioning was a reflex against being consumed. "They feared what would happen if your species knew it had been altered without consent. They feared panic. They feared entropy. They feared that if lines between us were revealed, your species might choose to burn the bridge before anyone could learn to cross it." He let the words fall like stones. Mateo crossed, knowing more than he could bear. He became what you call a hybrid. He accepted, perhaps with hope, that you could be saved by integration. Sarah wanted to smash the shard, to take it and hurl it into the grass and force herself back to the safety of not knowing. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Save us from what?" Kyle's face softened in a way she had not expected. "Extinction," he said. "Or assimilation reimagined as symbiosis. Your senior scientists have been working toward a solution to a cascade event. We approached slowly. Some of your programs collaborated willingly, others less so. Mateo was more than a volunteer. He was rewritten to be an emissary of potential union." The terms felt obscene and tender all at once. Sarah thought of her son's laugh, the way he had once told her that the stars weren't distant but shy. She imagined a child told that his body could be both intervention and weapon. She wondered, with the rawest part of her, whether Mateo had known and still chosen to step into that terrible and luminous role. "Prove it," she said finally. It was the only demand that felt like science and like prayer at the same time. Kyle nodded. He placed the iridescent shard in the palm of her muddy hand, and it pulsed there like a remembered heartbeat, warm beneath her skin. "Follow me," he said. "I will show you what was denied, but you will not like all of what you see. The truth is never only balm." She swallowed. The cemetery seemed to reel in and away like a camera lens. Beyond the hedge, a road cut through the valley. Beyond that, the shoulders of the city glinted like distant constellations. The choice she faced now was evident. To stay wrapped in the tidy grief she had been handed, a grave, a scroll of closed evidence, a life partitioned into before and after. Mateo's name burned in her chest like an ember begging for oxygen. She rose, hands trembling, and took the alien's offered path, even though every molecule in her body screamed that she should run back to the safety of denial. Behind them, a black shape slowed at the base of the hill, a sedan's tire whispering against gravel. Sarah did not see Agent Klein yet, but she felt him like a shadow falling across a sunlit page. The hill seemed smaller, the sky unkindly huge. She had walked in circles her whole life, trying to measure the universe, and had never imagined a day where the cosmos would point its finger and ask for a bargain. She adjusted the grip on the shard and stepped forward, Because grief, she realized, could be a compass as much as a chain. The sedan's rear light slinked into a red eye as it eased through gravel. A man in a dark coat watched them with the studied patience of someone who had rehearsed 100 different ways to look casual. Agent Klein, when he finally stepped from the car, smelled of cedar cologne and old authority. He wore his uniform like armor: crisp shirt, clipped badge, a mouth that had learned to say no on behalf of whole institutions. He did not hurry. His arrival was a punctuation mark. The world had come to a sentence that could not be read without shaking the page. "Sarah," he said, and the name was at once professional and personal, as if he'd kept a small file of how her grief looked on paper. Step away from the... She had not expected to think of him as human any longer. After years of implied smirks and paper cuts, Klein represented the body that had enforced the erasure. He had overseen testimonies, signed off on redactions, and allowed the word accident to stand in for what could not be named. Now he stood on the path between her and whatever this other thing, Kyle, offered. His jaw worked. He had the look of a man whose pleasant certainties were being rearranged by a fact he hadn't been briefed to handle. Kyle did not move. His presence attracted and repelled, like a magnet whose polarity Sarah could not quite name. "Agent Klein," he said, and the syllables turned Klein into a sound the air could taste. "You persist in denying an arrangement that once included your species' consent, even if that consent was coerced." Klein's hand moved toward his pocket, a reflex. Sarah recognized it, the gesture of a man who believed the world could be clenched into legalisms and metal. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What did you do to that boy?" "He was not done," Kyle said, "not finished by your protocols. He carried alterations meant to make him a bridge. He volunteered for a program that promised continuity. Some of your departments helped. He believed in survival. He chose in the only way he thought might deliver it." Klein's laugh was a small, cracked thing. "You expect me to believe some entity shows up here and tells us our people's children were turned into, what, ambassadors? We have protocols, extraterrestrial liaison offices. This is an unauthorized contact." Sarah saw him then, not just an agent, but an emblem of the machinery that had kept her quiet. How many mothers had he silenced with a rigid phrase, a closed file, an unreadable statement? How many scientists had been stamped with "denied" and told that the good of the whole outweighed the ache of one? She felt something sharp and animal stir in her chest. The recognition of the predator that had been allowed to legislate her silence. "You think you can prevent questions by asking them to stop?" she said. Her voice, steadier now, surprised her with its steadiness. Years of public speaking and forensic interrogation had left her with a practical vocabulary for anger. "Mateo was not a clause in your brief. He was my son. He had rights." Klein's expression micro-shifted, an attempt at sympathy, a practiced softening that rarely reached the eyes. "We grieve, Agent Alvarez. I grieve too. But public revelation risks panic. The program, if you can call it that, was meant to be a fail-safe against a cascade event that would have ended millions of lives. Calculator logic sometimes requires sacrifice." The word sacrifice froze in Sarah's throat like an accusation. "You sacrificed a child," she said, and the simplicity of it sounded like a conviction rather than a plea. "You don't know the full protocol," Klein replied. "You were removed from direct clearances." "For a reason." He looked at Kyle, suspicion sharpening his tone. "If you are an extra-government entity, you will not be allowed to walk away with whatever you brought. The shard, the recordings. You think you can take them and turn them into revelations? People will die from panic, from imitators." Kyle's static coat shivered as if irritated. We have no desire to inspire panic, but we will not watch our efforts be dishonored by a cover-up that reduced cooperation to sacrifice. We sought a bridge. We found a child who would bear the cost. That is not negotiation. That is injustice. At Klein's words, Sarah's hands curled into fists. She thought of Mateo's hands, how, at 10, he had fashioned a tiny telescope out of discarded lenses and a cardboard roll. How he'd rage when someone dismissed his plans as childish because he was, at heart, relentless. The man in front of her wanted to argue the ethics from inside his suit. The alien wanted to give her proof and pull a memory back into shape. She had to decide which kind of truth to trust. "Let me see the recordings," she said. It was less a demand than a declaration of intent. The shard in her palm hummed like a promise. Klein's eyes flicked to her hand. "No," he said flatly. "You're biased. You're vulnerable. We cannot allow unvetted dissemination to compromise ongoing operations." Operations? The word made Sarah's skin prickle. You call them operations. You hid a child's fate with that word. Klein's jaw tightened. "I offer you this, Dr. Alvarez. We will convene a review board. You will be granted access under supervised conditions. No press, no leaks. We'll find a way to—" "No." Sarah's response was immediate and final, louder than she intended. The world blurred at the edges as the shock of possibility, of being invited into their process, shifted into the cold realization that their process had failed her. "I don't trust a board that refused to see a file I placed on their desks. I don't trust a process that uses euphemism to hide bodies." Klein's mouth thinned into something like pity. "This path will make you an enemy of public safety," he warned. "The agency will act to prevent harm." "Then act against me," she said, "because I'd rather face your agents than keep pretending I don't know my son was taken in the name of a hypothetical future." Kyle's glass eyes lingered on her like a study. He had offered her a bridge. He did not know what it cost her to consider burning one. He also did not understand every atom of human stubbornness. That, Sarah realized, might be his currency. She had been a scientist long enough to know when probability favored an outcome. She had been a mother long enough to override probability. Klein exchanged a look with the agent in the sedan, someone who had remained in the car like an expectant witness. "You will regret this," he said, not as a threat to be carried out in the moment, but as a promise of procedural exhaustion. "If you go with him, Dr. Alvarez, we will have no choice but to contain any information you bring out." Contain. The word had texture, legal forms, court-ordered silence, the long, slow erosion of public memory. Sarah imagined a state that could step between a mother and the truth, that could lock away facts for stability. She imagined the shard crushed under a boot of bureaucracy. The idea of allowing the agency to become the arbiter of what she could remember was unbearable. "How do I know he won't manipulate me?" she asked Kyle. "How do I know he isn't here for an ulterior motive? You said you were envoys. You said you graphed memory. What guarantee do I have that Mateo will still be him?" Kyle's response was soft, as if speaking to a child. Memory, grafted, will be consistent with what he was. It will contain his choices, his laughter, his contradictions. We cannot command a person to be what they are not. We can restore what the program rewrote into him, the knowledge of what he was meant to do. The rest belongs to him. Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment Mateo's small face floated in her mind like a coin in sunlight. Bright, too familiar, already clanging with the weight of loss. His final messages had been technical, light. A hurried voicemail. "Everything's fine, Mama. This is bigger than we thought." Then static. When the official report arrived, it was clinical and thin and left her asking for contact that was never granted. For a long time, she had told herself that withholding pain was mercy. Now she could feel otherwise. Withholding truth was a violence. "If I go with you," she said, "I do this my way. I broadcast if I must. I will not let a dossier be closed again." Klein's laugh this time was harder. "You think making it public will help anyone? It will incite a social collapse in sectors that aren't ready. There will be panic. You will be used as a pawn by hysterics and fringe groups. You will be held responsible." Her anger rose then, not just at Klein, but at a system that refused to consider the ethical stain it had left. "If I don't make it public," she said, voice low and dangerous, "then the only thing we preserve is your comfortable silence. I will not bar my son into a file and call that respect." A breeze moved through the cemetery and carried a sound. Someone had lit a candle somewhere on the hill, the small flame shivering like the fragile hope she clutched. Cale did not press her for an answer. His patience felt alien and infuriatingly durable. He did not pull her hand toward him, but rather stood as if willing to be judged. "Then you will go with me," he said at last. "We will show you. We will not lie to you about the cost. You will see where the program crossed borders and how your son became the place where two species met. You must understand that a bridge, once seen, becomes a target." Klein made a sound like a reprimand in the back of his throat. "We will not allow a foreign entity to escort a potential whistleblower off American soil," he declared. "You may try," Cale said, and the coat around him hummed. The air tasted suddenly metallic, as if the shuttle's hull had scraped the sky and left a scent. "But know this, your species is already in motion. We are patient. We are not benevolent always. We are not malevolent always. We make offers because we are insecure about our own ends. We wish to be in alliance with yours." The word alliance did not sound like a salvation. It sounded like a negotiation, a ledger where lives were entries. Sarah's mind, trained to map systems, felt an almost perverse relief at the framing. If this was a negotiation, then there might be leverage. There might be a way to force truth into the light without ceding her son entirely. She held the shard tighter and made a decision that would probably fracture her world even further. "We leave now," she said. "No board, no waiting. If you debate, I will leave. If you try to withhold evidence, I will take it public. I will not be politely buried." Klein moved then, suddenly certain and sharp. His hand found a radio on his belt. "You're under observation," he said to her. "We can stop this." Cale's face, unexpressive but not unfeeling, tilted toward the agent. "If you stop us, you will break faith with a being who might have favored your survival. Consider what you set aside when you choose containment over truth." Klein's mouth closed. For a long beat they regarded one another, the human institutionalist and the alien envoy, each wearing a certainty about the future like armor. Sarah felt dizzy with the weight of what their positions implied. It was not simply a matter of proof and secrecy. It was the choice between being shepherded by authorities who had chosen the shape of their grief for them, and stepping into a wider, terrifying honesty. She met Klein's eyes. "Do what you must," she said, "but know that I will not be held hostage by silence again." He looked at her then, as if deciding whether she was inciting a disaster or lighting a necessary fire. The radio at his belt crackled. Behind him, another car's tires sang in the gravel. A news van, or backup, it did not yet matter. The hill, the grave, the church bell somewhere distant, everything pressed toward a hinge. Sarah stepped away from the grave, the shard heavy and humming in her hand. She had chosen a line now that could not be uncrossed. Behind them, the hedge blurred into city noise. Ahead, Kael's gaze was a compass. She realized, with a cold, clear grief, that crossing with him meant she would have to watch institutions she had once trusted be exposed and perhaps dismantled. It meant watching her son be moved from a private grave to an argument between species. The first step was the easiest and the hardest, to move forward with someone who could promise both restoration and ruination. The decision tugged at her like gravity, inevitable, inexorable, terrifying in its pull. They walked down the hill in a silence filled with the thrum of the shard and the distant authority of brakes on gravel. Sarah's shoes sank into soft mud. Each step felt like a decision made in a foreign tongue. The sedan idled like a patient animal at the base, Agent Klein's figure a black punctuation against the misted trees. Kael moved with a gait that suggested neither hurry nor fear. He simply existed in time differently, as if his strides steered days rather than hours. Sarah kept her hand in her pocket, the shard's warmth pressing against her palm through the fabric like a pulse she could both trust and fear. "Where are you taking me?" she asked after a while, not certain she wanted the answer and not sure she had asked for it at all. Kael's head tilted toward the city skyline, its offices and their reflections like a constellation dragged low. "A safe house," he said. "A place we can speak without an institution breathing down our necks. We will show you recordings and fragments gleaned from the program. We will give you memory grafts if you consent. We will give you Mateo." The last word was small and terrible and luminous. She gripped the edge of it like the rim of a cliff. Klein didn't attempt to follow. He stayed by the car, the authorities' posture folding into something painfully familiar, the official guardian of convenient lies. His radio buzzed. He barked terse commands. Sarah watched, and a part of her that had once adored process felt betrayed. Process had become an excuse for neglect. She thought of the file in her own desk, stamped with "denied" and tucked like a cheap relic. She had brought it to men like Klein and been told to let time heal. Time had not healed. It had laminated her grief into a quiet, permanent bruise. They left the graveyard behind, the flowers half buried in windswept grass, and moved into neighborhoods that smelled of exhaust and fryer oil. Kael's coat flickered at intervals, the static now less intimidating and more like a signal being modulated. Cars slowed and sped around them, horns answering some urban impatience it was beyond her power to soothe. Sarah's mind tumbled with possibilities, publicity, policy, panic, none of which mapped easily onto the visceral ache she carried. At a nondescript townhouse, Kael led her in through a basement door that smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. Inside, the room was minimal. A couch, a wall of monitors, a map dotted with pins, and a long table strewn with artifacts. Small things that refused to be ordinary. A fragment, like the shard, rested on a velvet cushion beneath a glass dome. And when she stepped closer, the hair rose along her arms as if recognizing kin. A voice on the speakers hummed with the frequencies of places she had once modeled with equations. On one monitor, an old feed flickered, grainy footage of a shuttle cabin, alarms, and the wild ballet of instruments. The sight of it, Mateo's face on a seat, the flash of a hand, the final static, was a punch to a gut she had thought she had already bled through. "How did you get this?" she asked, voice thin. She felt suddenly like someone torn open to the world, seams visible. Kael stood near the table, hands folded. "We monitored," he answered. "We took what we could. We infiltrated channels your agencies forgot to airlock. We preserved what your people tried to burn." It was an audacious confession, and she should have felt triumphant. Instead, watching the footage, she felt an erosion, proof that the boy she loved had been pried open and pressed into service for a future she didn't know she could accept. The shuttle's recording was raw, voices, technical counts, a scent of something like panic, and then a pattern in the audio that wasn't random, a rhythm layered beneath human speech, like a beat someone had sewn into the background of a lullaby. She recognized it in the way Matteo had once hummed to himself as he worked on an engine, a soft cadence she had always mistaken for habit. "Is that?" she began. Her hands trembled against the rim of the monitor. "Is that him?" Cale's glass eyes were steady. Some of it is human, some of it is not. His voice, sometimes, carries threads from the graft. That rhythm you hear is a foreign signature, a program heartbeat laid into the cabin systems as protocol. Her scientist's training fought with her mother's grief. The footage was undeniable, and yet curated, and Cale had the temperamental advantage of not being human, not bound by the same ethical horrors they evaded. "This proves he was altered," she said, finally. It was less a statement than a plea. "It proves he was made into a bridge," Cale said. "Whether he consented fully is something history will argue about. We can restore what he was given to remember. We can show you the choices he had, the words he sent, and more." The offer, like a guillotine of hope, fell across her breast. The gift, a chance to know more of the son she had lost. The price, turning him into evidence, a node in an argument she had not consented to join. She thought of Matteo's last texts, short, bright, oddly irreverent, and wondered if they had been his or the program's. She thought of his laugh, and how easy it had been for strangers to claim the right to define his death. They passed from footage to artifacts, thin, translucent panels that shimmered when tilted, a small capsule etched with star-like directions, a band of metal engraved with a pattern that felt like a name. Cale narrated in careful sentences, laying out timelines and collaboration points. He described scientists who had joined willingly, a faction within governments that traded autonomy for a chance at continuity. He named labs, dates, and the specific moment the shuttle's mission went off script. With each revelation, a new fracture opened in Sarah's world, fractures that split not only truth from lie, but love from policy. How many were like him, she asked, because if one child had been altered, the wrongness multiplied exponentially. "More than you expect," Cale said. "Fewer than we feared. Not all were children. Some were volunteers seeking solutions. Some were selected. The program used inconsistent ethics." Sarah felt a cold rage, not the brittle ire of being personally wronged, but the iron-hot burning of recognition, a system that rationalized sacrifice in the name of survival. She thought of Agent Klein's face outside the grave, the practiced pity he had offered. That pity had been a lid, neat, suffocating, and altogether human. "Why show me?" she asked suddenly. The question had a new edge. She needed to know whether Cale's motives were simple compassion or a tactical ploy. He approached the table and set his hand on an object that made the air hum, a lattice of light folded into stone. "Because your species will need witnesses," he said. "We could have taken this to your leaders, to dueling committees. But institutions who silence their own are not always trustworthy. You," he glanced at her with something that might have been respect, "you will make people listen." Her chest tightened. She knew then that she was being given an instrument as much as a miracle. Her life, her grief, her identity as the woman who had buried her son was being recontextualized into something political, into activism by default. The thought made bile rise in her throat. "We have more," Cale continued softly. personal logs, grafted segments from Mateo's memory bank. We can perform a graft that will restore certain sequences. His last clear thoughts, phrases he used, the way he mapped hope onto metal. They will feel real because your brain will accept them as its own history. Sarah thought of letting herself breathe, that small, deep inhalation she had not allowed since the funeral. "If I accept those grafts," she said slowly, "what does that do to me, to what I've built? Will I be changed?" "You will be," Cale admitted. "You will carry memories that did not come through ordinary loss. They will resolve certain griefs, but they will introduce questions. You will no longer be able to say with certainty where memory ends and program begins." The cost in identity struck her as sharply as any physical pain. Memory is a territory. To have its borders rearranged was to have land expropriated and re-granted. She had built herself on the foundation of not knowing, of a grief that had the raw edges she could name. Cale offered her relief, and relief demanded payment in continuity. Agent Klein's voice boomed from the other room, sudden and severe. "Dr. Alvarez, you must understand." He paused, breath collecting like stormwater. "We cannot allow this to proceed in this location. You do not have clearance for foreign technology." "Klein," Kyle said, calm, as if the syllable were a window rather than a warning, "you stand here to uphold an order that refused to consider a mother's right to truth. Tell me, will you protect systems or lives?" Klein's jaw tightened as he spoke the calculus of bureaucratic violence. "Systems protect millions. Without control, you endanger millions." Sarah watched them balance human lives like ledgers. The moral arithmetic was familiar and exhausting. Behind Klein's stern face, the agency's priorities unfurled: triage, containment, and the cold mitigation of panic. She wanted to shout that the agency had already sacrificed an individual for convenience, that their control had been built on a body. But she also understood the fragility of civilization, how revelation could splinter trust and breed chaos. "I don't trust systems that hid my son's fate," she said simply. "If your concern is lives, start by returning honesty." Klein's face shadowed with an expression that might have once been pity and had calcified into something else. "If you make this public, you will be the vector of destabilization." "And if you keep it secret," Sarah answered, feeling the fracture widen into a canyon, "you will be the keeper of a theft." They stood in that small downstairs room, a triangle of positions carved by different loyalties. Kyle's alien patience, Klein's institutional harshness, and Sarah's raw, aching maternal hunger for truth. As the conversation edged toward stasis, Kyle stepped forward and produced something from his coat, a small, folded strip of sound, no bigger than a stamp. He placed it in Sarah's palm with a gravity that felt ceremonial. "If you listen, you will hear him," Kyle said. "If you accept, you will open a door. If you refuse, you will keep a life buried beneath policy. The choice is yours." Sarah held the strip and felt its weight like an accusation and an answer. The shard in her other pocket vibrated as if in agreement or warning. Her breath came shallow and sharp. The world outside moved on. Cars, offices, a city unaware of the hinge upon which a woman's life would pivot. She pressed the strip to her ear, and the sound flooded her like the long-forsaken sea. A laugh, a curse, a clipped technical update. Mateo's voice, embodied and intimate. He sounded alive in a way that made her body betray her rationality. Her knees weakened. She wanted to collapse into all of the proof, to anchor herself in whatever it offered. But proof was not only comfort. Proof implicated others, and implicated her. Klein stepped forward, furious and small. "You're being manipulated," he hissed. By an entity that has goals we do not understand. Kale's glass eyes met his. Perhaps, he said. But manipulation is on a continuum. You imposed a manipulation when you chose to label a death a casualty rather than a moral decision. You have already rendered judgment by silence. The barb hit like something blunt, and there was no defense. Klein's shoulders slumped for the first time in the conversation. His radio crackled with orders from a distant control room, the voice of an institution deciding whether to act on instinct or law. Outside, tires shifted, the silence of the watching world pressing against the townhouse walls. Sarah felt the fracture widen into a chasm so wide she could see its other side. A public that would never be the same. An agency that would attempt to bile its way back into authority. An alien species that had extended an offer wrapped in its own needs. She had to decide whether she would be the one to cross, whether she would accept the graft that might make her son more present and therefore more stolen. She could hear her heart now, loud and insistent, and it answered for her. She placed the sound strip on the table and let the laughter die down into silence. "I want it all," she said, voice raw. "The recordings, the grafts, the proof. I want to know if he chose. I want the truth to be public. If any of you try to hide it again, I will scream until the air breaks." Klein's face was an oration of caution and offense. "You will regret this." "You will not stop me," she answered. And for the first time since Mateo's coffin had lowered into the hill, the conviction in her voice felt like a weapon she could own. Kale nodded once. "Then we begin." They were strained and fragile allies now, pulled together by grief and divergent aims. The fracture lines ran deep, between human comfort and cosmic offer, between state secrecy and the scalding honesty of a mother who refused to be quieted. As they prepared the apparatus for grafting and playback, Sarah felt a weight shift, not a return to what had been, but a rending open that would reveal more than the name on a tombstone. The secret was out. The fracture had become a breach. And in that breach, the possibility that Mateo might not belong solely to any of them flickered like a fragile, uncertain life. They began oddly domestic, with coffee handed across a lamplit table, and with Kale explaining grafting in metaphors she could hold. Threads, tapestries, a river rerouted through a town so the mills could turn again. The monitors were set to loop Mateo's recorded voice while Kale prepared an apparatus that looked like a halo of glass and wire. It hummed with the same low frequency as the shard in her pocket. Agent Klein paced outside the door like an authorized storm. Every crackle on his radio lifted a new anxiety. Still, in that room, for the first time since the funeral, Sarah felt a fragile compartment open in her chest where an answer might fit. "You must understand," Kyle said quietly as he adjusted the device. "We will not resurrect what you lost like a photograph returned to color. Memory grafts bring back vectors, sensory truth, decisions, emotional inflections, woven into the brain's fabric. The person who remembers will be changed. You may love him more or less for it." She watched his long fingers move, alien dexterity with human patience. He was close enough now that his scent, if alien creatures had scent, was a faint ozone like rain before lightning. There was an intimacy in it that filled her with both comfort and dread. "And you?" she asked. "What do you pay for this? Why show me everything now?" Kyle's glass eyes softened in a way she could no longer call merely clinical. "Because you are not a subject to be pacified," he said. "You are a node through which truth must pass. We have sought diplomacy, but we are also learning to bargain with compassion. The confession caught her like a hand at the base of the throat. Underneath the professional trappings, envoy, project, fragments, was a being capable of understanding her as more than a case file. It was terrifying and intoxicating. They started with a recording. Mateo's voice, closer now behind the halo, graspable in a way it had not been in a voicemail. He mentioned mechanics and sky coordinates, and then laughed. His laugh, the small, scolding sound she'd thought she'd imagined since the funeral. Tears came anyway, unpredictable and slanting, and Kyle did not look away. Instead, he placed a steady hand on her knee, the gesture neither patronizing nor cold. The contact was a bridge in itself, alien intent touching human need. Sarah felt something like forgiveness as well as something like treason. The press of skin steadied her. "Consent," she whispered, "the scientific requirement and the moral knot. Could he consent? Could a child?" "A hybrid can choose," Kyle said. "Mateo understood in ways you were not permitted to understand." He believed in a future where species could share code, biology, and care. He became a messenger because he hoped to avert an end. That belief does not make his sacrifice less human. The room narrowed to the halo, the recording, and the ember of a man she had loved. She nodded, more to herself than to him. And when she lay back beneath the ring of glass and wire, the world folded into a strange new geometry. Breath, hum, voice, and the shard's warmth pressed like a second pulse into her palm. The grafting felt like falling into a memory she had been waiting for, and also one she had not yet earned. Images stitched themselves into her head. Mateo's small hands on a circuit board, his stubborn face set against a cloning of possibility. A conversation with a scientist who had looked at him as if he were both son and specimen. There were moments of tenderness inside the graft, flashes of the boy reading at midnight, of him promising not to be afraid. And there were sterile corridors and whispered orders, a map of how his body had been negotiated. She tasted metal and lemon soap, heard laughter and an algorithmic chime layered beneath it. When she sat up the first time, she was crying harder, but her breathing was different, less hollow, more filled in. "You saw him," Cale said, voice careful. "What did you feel?" "That he chose," she said, unsteady. "He chose with fear. He chose with hope. He thought saving us was worth everything." The final word cracked off like a broken bone. The small quiet between them expanded into action. The townhouse vibrated with Klein's agitation as agencies decided whether to act. He called increasingly shrill orders into the radio. Steps on the stairs became prelude to a confrontation. Sarah felt the old fear of files sealed, of truth silenced, rise like bile. But the graft had retooled her grief into a new rigor. It was not merely catharsis she sought now. It was witness. Agent Klein and two men in tactical jackets entered, the door breaking with bureaucratic authority. They moved like a practiced instrument of containment. "Dr. Alvarez," Klein said, the name a steel blade. "Step away from the technology. The object in your possession is foreign and potentially dangerous. Surrender it." Cale rose, unarmed but imposing, his coat flickering around the edges like weather. "We will not surrender what reveals justice," he said. "We will not be the instruments of erasure." Klein's hand snapped to a holster, a small and human motion meant to reassert order. The agents flanked him, and for a breath the room held the taut expectation of violence. Sarah realized that betrayal could take the form of silence or of force. One quiet removed truth, the other threatened to remove lives. "I will not be quiet again," she said, standing. She felt the graft's residue like a chain and a key. "If you seize him, you seize the proof. If you take Kale, you take the only being who can validate what they did. Klein's gaze flicked to Kale and then to her, measuring consequences like currency. This will not end well, he said. For you, for him. Then the world did what it had been on the verge of doing. It ruptured into motion. The agent lunged forward, more to intimidate than to injure, and Kale moved with a speed that looked like grace but struck like a tide. He stepped between the man and Sarah, and their collision was less violent than it was inevitable. Kale's shoulder met the agent's chest and pushed him into the table. Electronics leapt and then died, monitors blacked out like the closing of eyelids. In the scramble, one of Klein's men lunged for the shard in Sarah's pocket. Kale reacted without hesitation. His long hand closed over the other's wrist, silencing strength with a pressure that did not crush, but contained. In those moments of force, Sarah saw two worlds negotiate power, metal and muscle against a calm that had the patience of deep oceans. She stepped forward and wrapped her hand around Kale's, both to anchor him and to be anchored. The touch was a vow. "You take him," Klein barked, voice fraying, "and you are making a criminal of yourself. You will be detained." "Detain me," Kale said softly. "Detain the one who kept a child as a clause, if you would balance this scale." Klein hesitated, and Sarah saw the faint human thing in his face, fear that the machinery he served might not be justified anymore. She made a choice that was partly reckless and partly the only moral geometry left. She reached for the live feed on the table, stabbed at a record button, and then shoved the strip of audio, the one with Mateo's laugh, into the slot. The monitors flickered and came alive, and through their small speakers, across a patchwork of hacked frequencies Kale had left open, Mateo's voice spilled into airwaves that threaded like veins through the city. Outside, a car alarm shrieked, a phone buzzed in a pocket. Someone in another neighborhood picked up and listened. Klein's face turned an unreadable color as multiple radio channels lit up with the tape, and then, like a struck match, the world began to ignite with the sound of a son speaking from beyond the grave. "No!" Klein shouted. He lunged to cut the broadcast, but Kale, still holding the agent's wrist, moved with a gentleness that was not weakness. "You will not discredit the evidence," he said. "You will not reroute history again." The scramble turned into a tableau. Kale vulnerable to arrest, Sarah defiant and shaking, Klein furious and small. The tape kept playing, and with every syllable, the narrative that had justified secrecy began to erode. Sarah looked at Kale, at the glass that had no human tears, but something like concern. And in that moment, she understood the nature of the bargain she had made. To take truth public was to risk everything. To keep it quiet was to kill what remained of her son again. She stepped toward Klein and released her hand from Kael's grasp to place it instead on the agent's shoulder, a human touch that said she would face whatever law he had. "Take me," she said, voice even but bright as a blade. "Detain me if that keeps our story, but you will not take him. You will not take the proof." The words hung between them, a sacrament and a threat. Kael drew in, almost imperceptibly, and for a second the static of his coat surged like an intake of breath. He stepped forward and kissed her, not a ceremonial press, but a longer thing that asked for trust and gave a promise. It was an alien gesture transformed into human language, a promise to stand beside her, to share in the cost. The kiss felt like returning to a sun-warmed place after a long, cold night. It felt like treason against the silence she'd been trained to keep, and like salvation. Agent Klein hesitated, the human machine sputtering with surprise. In that hesitation, authority faltered. Reporters on the fringe frequencies took the tape and pushed it into channels they shouldn't have. Within minutes, the story was a splinter spreading through newsrooms, forums, and radios. Klein barked orders, but the wheels of disclosure were already moving. They took Kael, not with the brutality of an execution, but with the efficiency of a capture. Men in plain clothes moved in. Kyle did not resist. Before he was led away, he leaned down to Sarah. His voice, steadier than she had heard it, touched her ear. "Thank you," he said, "for choosing truth, for making the bridge. I will remember you." Was that a promise or a goodbye? She could not tell. He was led from the room, the door closing like an eyelid, and the monitors behind him flickered with Mateo's laughter, echoes that would not be easily smothered. Klein faced her then, his posture now an armorless fatigue. "This will not stand," he said. "We will pursue every legal avenue." "Then pursue me." Sarah's voice did not tremble. The graft had steadied her purpose. "Expose the truth, or stop pretending your laws are moral." He looked at her as if weighing whether she was dangerous or holy. Outside, the city's pulse had quickened. A movement had begun that could not be easily untied. She had traded quiet for revelation, and in doing so had traded a private son for a public necessity. The cost sat in her ribs like a new, difficult organ. She sank onto the couch, the room spinning slightly. And for the first time since that morning at the grave, she allowed herself a small, unashamed sob. It was for Mateo and for the fracturing of a world she had once thought measurable. It was for the touch of Kyle, for the warmth of the shard, and for the knowledge that she had lit a fuse she could not blow out. When Klein left to marshal the agency's response, Sarah sat with the echo of a kiss and the knowledge that the bridge had been built. The city hummed with the news of it, and across networks people were listening to a boy's voice who had once been silenced. She had no map for what would come next, only the clear star of one imperative. She had opened a door and would not let it be slammed shut again, even if she had to stand in the doorway and argue with the world until it listened. The days that followed unspooled like a body relearning how to breathe, jagged and necessary. The recording Kyle released threaded itself through morning shows and midnight feeds. The shard's hum drew lawyers and journalists and mothers with names like hers. Agents arrived with warrants and apologies in the same breath. Protests gathered in parks and outside low-slung agency buildings. Strangers brought flowers that were not for any grave she could name. The world, once neatly governed by denial, became noisy with questions. In custody, Kyle was unreachable by protocol, but reachable in small, deliberate ways. He sent messages through channels he trusted, single phrases tucked inside legal filings, a hand-drawn map of constellations that matched the scar on Mateo's wrist, a plea that she keep the grafts intact. The agency insisted they were containing a contagion of misinformation. Sarah watched the hearings and the leaked footage and felt both vindicated and sickened. They debated ethics on podiums while she remembered the weight of a boy's laugh in her bones. The graft settled into her like a second language. Some mornings, Mateo's voice arrived fully formed, like sunlight through curtains. Other moments, it felt like an echo shaped by someone else's hands. She found herself talking to him aloud in the kitchen, asking about spliced coordinates, about jokes only they used to share, and sometimes answering with a certainty that surprised her. The memory was not a perfect return. It was a reclamation complicated by technical truth. Love, she discovered, could hold both. The agency tried to bury Kyle in tribunals and redacted claims. The public demanded transparency. Lawsuits sprouted like wildflowers in spring, and universities called for inquiries. Old colleagues reached out with cautious hands. Some offered solidarity, others offered silence. Mateo became, impossibly, both a case and a boy. Sarah stood at microphones, trembling and precise, and read his messages aloud, until reporters stopped framing her as unstable and began to ask whom they had trusted to decide what counted as human. At night, she returned to the hilltop, not to the open grave, but to the marker she had placed and now rubbed with cleaner hands. She spoke to the sky, to Kyle beyond walls, to agencies that might someday learn grace, and to the son who lived in stitched memory. Sometimes she imagined him standing at the edge of the orchard they'd once planned to plant together, a boy who loved engines and constellations equally. She did not pretend the restoration was whole. She did not pretend Kyle's intervention came without cost. What she held instead was a new covenant, truth traded openly for consequence. Months later, an unmarked parcel arrived at her door, a plain envelope containing a single small coin of iridescent glass, and a note in handwriting that was not hers but that somehow felt like a promise. The note read, in a language made gentle by translation, "Thank you. Keep the bridge open." She put the coin beside Mateo's photograph, and for the first time since the funeral, let the photograph catch the light. The city outside wrestled with policy and panic, with policymakers learning the vocabulary of apology. Inside her little kitchen, grief and reclamation made a new map. She would keep walking it, sometimes forward, sometimes circling, but always with a hand on the shard's memory and the other on the world she had not known she still needed to defend. In the last light of evening, she climbed the hill and watched the skyline inhale the sun. A plane traced a tiny silver route, and for a moment, the motion looked like a bridge across the sky. She whispered Mateo's name into the cooling air and felt, not undoing, but the quiet ungluing of certainty, an opening that was neither complete salvation nor final defeat, but the place where a mother and a new kind of witness began the work of living with what truth required.